Perfect. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about us.
Mm-hmm.
So my name is Janae Padmore, and my colleague is Brandon McCord. We will be
Hi, Brandon.
doing the interview. We are an international development course and here at Virginia Tech. And we're a mixture of urban planners and public health professionals. So we have really discovered the interconnectedness of international development within the planning field and public health. So everything that you will be telling us and informing us on will be really beneficial to our futures in this field.
Great. I teach students just like you over here in Minnesota in our Masters of Development Practice program.
Awesome. So you already know how scatterbrained we are, so so bear with us.
No. I know that you come from many different disciplines and different backgrounds. So
I appreciate that. Thank you. So we'll dive in. So can you tell us about your background and how you found yourself in this field? Because we know you have a medical engineering background, and a mechanical engineering background, and this has led you to urban planning. So
yeah, it's actually a long story, but I'll start when I was 16. How about that? At age 16, I became interested in development. I was living in Egypt at that time, and I was very much wanting to study something that would contribute to my country's development. And at that point, I had read some stuff, and I was convinced that energy, and in particular at that time, nuclear energy, was going to be the way that I could contribute. So I was already in science, and I liked science. So I decided that I was going to study nuclear engineering. I was very, and when I went to Stanford as an undergraduate, and there was no undergraduate major in nuclear engineering. And so I worked with some professors and said, okay, we'll do a self-designed major. And I created a major that combines physics and mechanical engineering. It only took about a year for me to be disabused of the notion of nuclear engineering as being not very practical, connected to a lot of weaponry and environmental pollution, and basically being very risky. But I was still continued to be very interested in energy issues. And so I continued with figuring out that I could get a bachelor's in physics and a master's in mechanical engineering with a focus on energy. And I focused more on solar energy. Mm-hmm. And at that time, energy was a big issue because it was in the late 70s, at the time when oil prices were climbing very rapidly as a result of the oil embargoes and the oil disruptions of the 1970s, the first and second oil shock. You might have heard about those. And so energy was on everybody's mind. But I became more and more interested in the social sciences and in the social and political aspects of development, although I didn't take many courses in that area. I think my first econ course was when I was a senior year. But I liked it a lot, and I thought, oh, I can do this stuff. I had fairly good math background. And so I was thinking I would continue in something that is on the intersection between kind of the engineering and economics, but I wasn't sure what. In the meantime, I had to go back home to do my military service. It was a draft system where you actually have to go and serve. And if you don't, you get in real trouble. So I had to actually go back to Egypt. And luckily, in my first week there, when I just arrived, I met this very interesting person who had started a consulting firm called Environmental Quality International. It's an urban planning consulting firm. Had really been my first encounter with, with urban planning. And he said, why don't you come and work with me? I said, well, but I have to go do my military service. He said, we'll figure that out, but come and work with me. And so turned out that he was working with one of the most marginalized groups in Cairo at that time, who are the people who make their living on collecting garbage and recycling it. It's an informal group called the Zabalin. And like in many other cities where there are scavengers on public dump site who go through the garbage to pick out any materials they can recover, the Zabalin, in fact, collected the garbage from the source. So they went around with the donkey carts and collecting garbage from the barriers. But they had a lot of problems, among which the government wanted to basically end their system because they thought they were primitive and dirty and not modern enough. And so I found that my job was to basically be a community organizer. Here I am, an engineer, and I ended up being a community organizer to try to organize this group into a formal association that could represent them vis-a-vis government. So that's really how I got into urban planning, and I became very interested in informal economies, in the way in which people make a living in the city in ways that kind of are outside official control.
Right.
So I'll stop here.
That's awesome. You know, and I appreciate that, you know, that introduction to how you got into urban planning, because so many of us think that you have to get some kind of training or education to help you get into that field. But it sounds like, you know, someone approached you and that led you, like, was a gateway into
Exactly.
this field. That was awesome.
They gave me the opportunity that allowed me to discover this field, and then later on go back to school and get some training.
Awesome. So I guess we could say that is probably the most impactful education or experience you've had to lead you into that. Would you say that? Absolutely, especially early in my career, yes. Awesome. I like that. I think that's really inspirational for all of us, especially I know for me, certainly, because this is a career change. So I guess we're always looking for that. Yeah, I mean, often it's having a preparation that people value and appreciate. So people think, and then it doesn't have to be a specific preparation in a particular field. People value your ability to think, your ability to problem solve, your ability to write, to communicate. And if you have that and you're at the right place at the right time, the good opportunities will fall in your lap. Awesome. Thank you. So how do you connect your world of academia to the world of practical experience and policy making? Quite a bit, actually. So since I finished my PhD when I was with Chris at Cornell, I actually got this job here in Minnesota in academia, but very soon thereafter, I became involved in an organization which is called the Economic Research Forum, which is based in Cairo and serves countries all the way from Morocco to Iran and Turkey as well. So Arab countries as well as Iran and Turkey. And that organization is dedicated to do research that has policy relevance, that informs policy in some way. And so I was one of the founding members of that organization as early as 1993. And I'm very involved with it 27, 25 years later, however many years it is. And right now I direct the thematic area for labor market and human development, labor markets and human development, which is a research area. Now, this organization is dedicated to promoting research that informs policy and how to communicate with policymakers. So we have a lot of interactions with policymakers through that. But in addition, in 2005, I got the opportunity to apply for a job as a regional director for an organization called the Population Council. The Population Council is an NGO that is based in New York
that works all over the world. And it's also dedicated to conduct research that would provide for evidence-based policy. Again, it's not academic research, it's applied research to support policymaking. And I got the job as regional director. So I was based in Cairo for 3 years. And again, the region was West Asia and North Africa. So it covered everything from Pakistan to Morocco. And that really was the 3 years in which I was very much involved with policymakers on a day in, day out basis, presenting the results of research and discussing how that can affect policy. And once you form connections and networks, those remain with you. So, for example, I'll give you an example, another more recent example. We recently did a survey in Jordan. Jordan is a country that, as you know, has been affected by a very large influx of Syrian refugees and by also economic crisis as a result of the conflicts that are going on in the region. And as a result of the survey, we organized a conference about what is the impact of the Syrian refugee influx on Jordanians in terms of jobs, housing, education, a variety. And policymakers were extremely interested. I mean, we got to meet with the Prime Minister, with the Minister of Planning, with the Minister of Education, Minister of Labor, and to explain to them what the results were, and they were extremely interested in hearing it. So when you have something interesting to say for them, they listen.
That makes sense. Thank you. And that actually touches on a couple of points that we would ask later on. So we appreciate that.
Great.
And to kind of piggyback on the question that I just asked, what are the differences in attitudes you have noticed in academia versus people that are on the ground?
Well, okay. So there is definitely a lack of patience with the sort of nitty-gritty that academics insist on to make sure that the results are reliable and true. So, for example, academics spend a lot of time on methodology, on data sources, on trying to make absolutely sure they have the right, they call that identification strategy. Are we identifying cause and effect in the right way? And policymakers just want you to tell them something that's useful for their work. And so they're not maybe less insisting on the methodology and the identification and all that. And they want a message that they can translate into policy. So, I find that it is possible for academic to talk in a way that policymakers will understand and value, but we have to learn to keep our nitty-gritty work on methodology and all that in the background and just be sure that we're presenting reliable results. So have discussion among ourselves about how reliable the results are, but then when you talk to policymakers, you talk about the result itself and what it means for them.
Awesome, thank you. I appreciate that. So we're going to move into discussing the field. So can you paint a picture about life in megacities in the Arab world for informal workers and youth?
Sure. So basically, you have what I call a transition going on, and a transition between fairly traditional modes of living and working and learning to what I call modern modes of living, working, and learning, except that, so the traditional mode of living, working, and learning would be where you finish school relatively early, you transition into a job with your family or in a family business, and you don't actually work for a large organization. You might work on the farm, or you want to work on small informal establishments, and then you marry early, and you're becoming an adult fairly early, and that's kind of one mode of living that mostly happens a lot in rural areas and in urban areas among kind of less educated groups. Now, as people get education, increasing education, which is happening, they aspire to a more modern transition in which they are staying longer in school. Once they finish school, they want to get a formal job in a formal organization with benefits and they also want to so they want to work for a wage rather than for the family and they also want to marry relatively later and have fewer children and that sort of thing. Now, so that's what they aspire to, but often the education part gets realized. People are increasingly getting more education, but once they finish their education, they find that the labor market is not providing the sorts of jobs they were expecting or aspiring to. And so they look for these jobs for a while, and that's why unemployment goes up for educated people, because they really want to get these formal jobs, but these jobs aren't there for many people. And as a result, they end up in an informal employment, either in their own family business or if they don't have one, in as a casual wage employee or an informal wage employee for someone else. Again, in a small business, but that is not related to their family. Now, those people tend to be fairly dissatisfied because they have not managed to reach their aspirations that have been developed and promoted by their education. So that's how. Now for women, women tend to, the focus for many women, again, education has increased quite substantially. In fact, there is no education gap between men and women in much of the region right now. Only in a few countries are there gaps. In fact, women are more educated now in most countries of the region. However, once they come to the labor market, they find that working in an informal job for someone else runs into a lot of social barriers. Their families and their communities don't want them to go to work for a stranger in a small establishment in an informal job. That's frowned upon. And so if they don't find their formal jobs, they either remain unemployed for a while and then they drop out of the labor force altogether. So labor force participation, even for educated women, is quite low, and women, have this period of time, because now they're marrying later, between finishing school and getting married, where they're trying very, very hard to find jobs and often unsuccessfully.
Wow, thank you so much. I remember reading in one of your articles about how there's risk of sexual harassment and in the workforce for women, and so that touches on what you were saying, how this is frowned upon to work for a stranger.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you have is a situation where women have a very strong preference to work in large workplaces where there are many other women around.
Right.
And especially young unmarried women, and also in workplaces that are close to home, because traveling in the public transport, which is very overcrowded and very difficult, exposes them to a lot of risk of harassment. And it's not just being exposed to harassment which happens, it's also the perception that you are likely to be exposed to harassment. And the communities around them are very protective and feel that women being exposed to harassment is a big problem, and so they would rather limit their mobility and their employment than having them face that risk.
I gotcha. Thank you. Sorry, Chris, I don't know where the echo is coming from. It just came. No, sorry. I muted it. So.
Ragui, do you hear an echo?
No, I don't.
It might be coming when Janae asks you a question. It might be coming off your speaker and then back into your microphone, back to us. But there's no way of addressing that short of you muting off and on. This is the first time this has come up. It just started like 5-6 minutes ago.
Yeah, and I did the earphones so that it wouldn't echo, but still doing it. Okay. Sorry.
Technologies always gets in the way.
So we had a wonderful opportunity to read about dualism. Can you explain dualism in labor markets and why the concept is so important for understanding developing potential?
Yes, dualism is actually a very old concept. In fact, it's probably the concept that has defined development economics. So I don't know, I'm hearing another. So if you remember, there was a field of economics, and the field of economics applied to both developing and developed countries. And then in the 1940s and 50s, people started talking about development economics, a special economics for developing countries. And one of the most influential authors there was a guy called Arthur Lewis. I don't know if you read about the Lewis model, but Arthur Lewis essentially said developing countries are made up of two sectors. One of them is modern and capitalist, and one of them is traditional and mostly focused on traditional agriculture. And these two sectors function in very different ways. And in fact, the modern sector pays a slightly higher pay than what you can earn in the traditional sector. So you attract people to go to the modern sector. And in fact, he characterized development as people moving from this traditional sector to this modern sector in over time. Now, that was fine, but then other people came along, including in 1970, a guy called Michael Todaro, who said, well, this separation in the labor market between the modern sector and the traditional sector can create an unemployment problem. Because what you have is the wage in the modern sector is artificially kept higher than in the traditional sector by some institutional mechanism, whether it's public sector employment or unions or whatever. So that wage being kept higher basically prompts people to, because they feel that they want these higher paid jobs, there aren't enough of them, so they queue for them in the form of an unemployment queue. So basically you have that artificially higher wage for the same quality worker. So you have a same quality worker in both sectors getting paid a different wage, makes a lot of people want to queue for these high paid jobs. And in the meantime, you get a lot of unemployment, which is inefficient. And now, these models have been modified over the years, but the main issue here is the fact that some institutional intervention creates a situation where there is this disjointness in the labor market between the same quality worker being paid more in one segment of the economy and being paid less in the other segment of the economy. And what I've used that argument to describe what happens in public sector labor markets, where public sector workers are paid more in the public sector than they would be paid in the private sector. And in particular, when you add all the benefits and the job security, etc. So there's a lot of queuing going on, especially among educated workers who are eligible for these jobs, for these public sector jobs. And as a result, basically you have very high unemployment among the educated, which is a feature that is very characteristic of the Middle East and North Africa region. It's in the US, for example, unemployment tends to be highest among the least educated. It's the opposite in the case of the Middle East and North Africa. Now, what that does when you have this kind of discontinuity in the labor market is that you have the private sector generates less employment for these workers. And these workers want to avoid the private sector as much as possible. And so you get this kind of disjointness in. And one of the results is high graduate unemployment.
That is, it's always interesting to see the different perspective just like you said, in the United States, it's higher here in, with the uneducated.
Yeah.
So because we are coming close to my end, I'm going to jump to discussing the different economic levels in over there. So there are many different countries in the Arab world that are at different economic levels, like I said. And Yemen is almost a failed state.
I wouldn't say almost. I would say it is a failure.
It is a failed state. Thank you. And neighboring countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they offer world-class facilities, educational opportunities, and are resourceful. So what, have you found any effective strategies to fill development gaps in the region?
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's the million-dollar question, if you want. But the reality is that the region is very bifurcated. It's probably as you mentioned, the differences among countries in this region are probably greatest than in any other region in the world. Partly because of the discovery of oil in some countries that had very small populations, and other countries have very large population and a very low natural resource base. So I was going to Yemen in 2006, 2007 as part of my job at the Population Council. We wanted to do some programming there. And even at that time, 10 years ago or more, I was saying Yemen is going to become a failed state. And it just, when you looked at it, it didn't compute. There was a pretty large population for the resources that were available. Most of the population was living in rural areas where there was a very arid environment. And so they put a lot of pressure on water resources. The population looked like it was going to triple between then and 2050, which is a very rapid population growth, very, very high fertility rate. And the natural resources were being depleted at a very high rate. The water table, for example, was dropping by 2 meters every year. Now, on the other hand, on the political side of things, the ruler there was essentially staying in power by pitting one tribe against the other and following a sort of divide and rule strategy. And so it looked like a very fragile situation. And in fact, when the Arab Spring came in 2011, it unraveled and the situation deteriorated very, very fast. So Yemen, the basis of a lot of the failed states in the region, whether it's Yemen or Syria, for example, there is an environmental demographic dynamic that then gets exacerbated by a political system that is unable to handle grievances and people who are being marginalized and dislocated. So in the case of Syria, it was a very, very major drought that was pushing people outside of the rural areas because of drought conditions into the cities, and mostly poor farmers. And this was creating a lot of instability in the cities. And then when the Arab Spring came, these are the cities that blew up the fastest. So there is a complex kind of environmental, demographic, economic, and political nexus that results in these countries becoming failed states. Now, in the case of UAE and Saudi Arabia, they have the luxury of having huge oil resources and the ability and a very small population. And so these are countries where most of their labor is imported from somewhere else. And they can lavish a great deal of resources on their citizens in the form of education, housing, jobs in the government, and public services, etc. And so far, they've managed to do that successfully because of these big oil resources.
Wow, that was a lot of amazing information. I feel like some of this stuff we just don't hear about in the news. So this is
absolutely,
this is awesome. So now I'm going to hand the baton over to my colleague, Brandon. And we have some other questions that maybe we can touch on later, but I'm going to give control over to Brandon.
Okay.
Sure. Um,
Hi, Brandon.
Good morning. It's nice to have you here. I'm gonna take this mic off.
Is there an echo when I do this?
I'm fine. It sounds fine on my end, but I don't know at your end.
Okay.
I don't hear any echo yet, Brandon. So perhaps that was Janae's fault. We can blame her for it. Just kidding, Janae.
Okay, great. I'm trying to see through these questions, what to ask next. Okay, we can go to, I'm trying to think of the public health people too in this class. So one question that we have is, there are more refugees today than there have ever been on the planet. What are some thoughts on providing economic development to these newly formed communities in varying locations across North Africa and the Middle East? I know we have issues going on in Libya. We have people traveling to Europe via Libya. We have refugees from Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Do you have any strategy or thoughts about these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've worked most closely on the issue of Syrian refugees in Jordan, but Syrian refugees are also all over the region. They are going to Lebanon, they're going to Turkey, and through these countries to Europe. So as you said, the numbers, in fact, the numbers of refugees that are displaced in the surrounding countries are much, much larger than the numbers ending up in Europe. We hear a lot more about those who go to Europe because the Europeans make a very big fuss. But if you think about it, there are approximately 1.3 million Syrians in Jordan. There are about 1.8 million in Lebanon. There are 2 million in Turkey. And those are the countries that are really taking the brunt of hosting these refugees. So one of the issues is conflict, of course, and conflict, as I said, doesn't emerge out of a vacuum. Conflict emerges out of a destabilized environment, demography, and economy nexus. So you have, when you have that kind of destabilization, it's very easy for political systems to collapse into conflict because they're unable to deal with the sorts of changes that are required to handle population displacement and migrant and what I call environment refugees, if you want. So what's happening is that these countries are being destabilized internally. They're falling into conflict and they're pushing refugees to all the countries around them, which in turn tends to destabilize the countries around them. Right now, Jordan is having a very hard time, partly because of the refugees, but partly because of the conflict in the region, to simply meet its own obligation to its own people. And so you have a lot of political pressure resulting on the government there as a result of that. Now, Libya is another interesting case. It's a country that had a lot of resources. They had oil. However, they again had an authoritarian ruler who ruled by divide and rule, by basically trying to keep the most of the tribes in the country fighting each other, and he is controlling that situation. So the moment that ruler was removed, they started fighting among each other, and the basis of the state collapsed in Libya. Now, once you have countries like Libya, Libya is not sending too many of its own refugees outside, but it's becoming a magnet for basically human traffickers who are using the chaos in Libya to channel refugees from countries that are in conflict and have environmental problems and in Africa into Europe. so Libya is really a jumping off point because there's no government to control the human trafficking situation there. Now, what you have though is what's kind of driving this in a big way is the fact that you have an imbalance, a demographic imbalance between Africa on the one hand and the Middle East, and Europe on the other hand. Europe's population is shrinking. The number of young people in Europe is declining. The number of people who can work and pay taxes is declining relative to the number of the elderly. And they have an extreme need for labor, especially young labor. That is driving huge demand for people from the region surrounding Europe to come and work in low-level jobs in Europe, who no Europeans want to do it at this point. And on the other hand, on the southern part of the Mediterranean and south of that in Africa and in the Middle East, you have a youth bulge, which is a lot of young people who are not able to find productive employment in their own countries. And so what's that's showing up now as illegal migration flows. But I think if Europe had an organized migration strategy and policy that would organize labor flows from labor surplus countries, it can meet many of its needs without creating these illegal flows of migrants and refugees. Now, why do the Europeans not do it? Because migration is not just an economic phenomenon, it is a cultural phenomenon. And culturally, the Europeans don't want people who don't look like them coming to their countries. You know, it's just there's a lot of anti-immigrant feeling there. But in terms of need, the need is definitely there. Now, so you have a basically the issue of refugees is one in which the world is going to have to learn how to deal with as an international response. You cannot rely on the countries directly surrounding the conflict countries to absorb the cost and the burden of dealing with the refugees. You have to have a more international response to support them in doing that.
No, that was great. That was a lot of information. You connected to a number of questions I'm looking at. But yeah, it's just interesting seeing that. I've had a lot of friends talk about Libya, and in this region, there's so much involvement with the U.S. and Syria, Libya. Trump just signed a $1 billion arms deal to Saudi Arabia. They're currently bombing Yemen, so it's a lot of issues going on here, and just what does this do? But I mean, there was one question you touched on about how other countries destabilize and do affect your work, and they affect other countries. Looking at
yeah, I mean, so for instance, I would love to do research in Syria or Libya or even Yemen, but it's impossible, right? I mean, the conditions are not there to be able to go and work in these countries. And so often you work on the consequences of these countries being destabilized by working in neighboring countries. So I worked in Jordan, I work in Tunisia, which is affected by what's going on in Libya. I'm planning, the next project is going to be in Sudan. And Sudan has its own problems of the South separating off and being itself in major conflict, South Sudan. So a lot of countries in that region, as you say, are in conflict, and the conflicts affect the countries around them, and that provides at least some opportunity for me to do my work.
Okay. So going past conflict. Do you find yourself working closely with private organizations to invest in economic development opportunities as opposed to state-run economic development projects? And do you have a preference to either or?
Well, okay, no, I work with NGOs quite a bit. So these are private organizations, but they're private not-for-profit organizations. and they are trying to assist government in some of those public purposes that development is all about. I don't work directly with for-profit private organizations, although my work tries to create an environment in which, or at least tries to promote an environment in which they can work effectively and create jobs. So I believe in creating a level playing field for private organizations to be able to compete and create jobs and grow, and that is often through working with government to create the right policy environment to do that. But with the work with NGOs, I'm directly involved in projects that try to experiment with innovative approaches to reach the most marginalized in the society as a way of demonstrating how something would work, so that then later on the government with its larger scale can take up these programs and implement them. So if we're working with a project with a foundation, a private foundation in Egypt, to work on what's called targeting the ultra poor. So it's a project, it's called a graduation program, where you actually intervene in such a way that you graduate people out of poverty. And these are often referred to as asset-based strategies, where you transfer to poor families a major asset, and then you support them as they learn how to manage that asset. So an asset could be livestock, for example. And these have proven very successful in other contexts. And so we're trying it out in Egypt to see how we can target the poorest of the poor and help them graduate out of poverty. So that's a project I'm doing with a private organization, but it's a foundation. So it's a...
No, that's great. You just touched on the next question, just talking about innovative strategies. So that was perfect.
Uh-huh.
But how what does this look like with community engagement with these specific populations you're trying to target?
Yeah, that's really a very important issue. So my first experience with community engagement is when I explained to Janae right after out of college. I went and worked as a community organizer for the garbage collectors of Cairo. And that's how I learned to, first I came into this wanting to get things done. And then I found that getting what I wanted to get done was not going to be possible unless you gain the trust of the community and you gain some credibility. And so I found that often I had to work with community leaders to solve other problems, things that I wasn't there for initially, but that were extremely important for the community, because that was the crisis that they were dealing with at the moment. And it's only by working on that crisis that I could gain their trust and credibility to work on the more long-term issues that I was there for. So I find that really being there for the community and helping them deal with their daily crises. In fact, the poor communities are facing crises all the time, and this is where you can build the credibility that's necessary. Now, where there are usually no formal organizations. In fact, my task was to create a formal organization, but there was a tremendous amount of informal organization, in the sense that these communities were quite organized. They knew who their leaders were. They knew how to make decision making through consultation, etc. And so you have to understand that before you start kind of imposing something from outside. You really have to understand how the community works, how it makes decisions, who the leaders are, how do they gain their leadership position, etc. And that's often not written anywhere. It's not documented anywhere. It's stuff that you have to discover by being there and being there with the life of the community. I'll give you another example in this project that I was just mentioning about targeting the ultra poor. So there are lots of statistical methods that we use to identify who the poor are. So we could go into a community and say, we know who the poor are, and we're going to go and help them. But in fact, what the methodology of the project does is that it says you go into community and you do what's called a PRA, which is a rapid, it's basically a poverty assessment that is a consultative project, a process with the community. You bring the members of the community together and you ask them who the poor are. You ask them who among them is most deserving of assistance, rather than bringing your statistics from outside. Now they will tell you, okay, here's this group, that group, and that group. You actually ask them to do a ranking of people in their community based on need. And then you can go and verify that using statistical techniques and surveys. But you start by getting the community buy-in in terms of who is to be assisted in this community and who needs the assistance the most. That's going to be much more credible than coming from the outside and say, I know already who the poor are.
No, that's great. That's great. So Chris just posed a great question. I was just thinking this in my head. I didn't know how to ask it or like how to go about this. So I was in Egypt about like in 2016, went to visit a friend. It was really interesting, but it kind of connects to this question. So okay, so how does your work in North Africa, in the Middle East, and South Asia, does your cultural identity as an Egyptian-born non-Muslim face any challenges in working in majority Muslim cultures or in non-Arab cultures? And I thought that was really interesting, a really great question. Yeah. Well, yeah,
You know,
don't have much time.
I personally have not faced any issues or problems related to my identity as a non-Muslim Arab or Egyptian working in the region. In fact, I find that, of course, being Egyptian helps a lot all over the region, not just in Egypt, because you can speak the language, you can connect on a cultural level. Most people outside of Egypt don't know my religious identity anyway. They don't have a concept of a non-Muslim Arab in most countries, and so they will. It doesn't come up, and I don't bring up my religion very often in my work. Now in Egypt, people know, but in fact, you gain respect and credibility through your work and through what you do, and I work with all kinds of groups in Egypt without any problems. So I haven't faced personally any issues with my identity. Now the identity is an issue still, though. I mean, identity in general, that people do perceive themselves as being one identity or the other, that affects the work in various ways, but it hasn't directly affected my own involvement based on my own identity in a negative way.
Oh no, that's great to hear. Yeah, because when I was over there, everyone assumed I was Egyptian, everyone assumed I was Muslim, and it was during Ramadan. So
yeah.
I'm out going to museums and like, should I drink this bottle of water with me in front of everybody, or heads were turning, like, what are you doing? Kind of this type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that happens. I personally try not to drink in public or eat in public during Ramadan.
Right.
But I go to meetings where people are fasting and they know I'm not a Muslim, and they offer me tea and coffee and it's not an issue. I mean, but I try to be respectful and not eat in public during Ramadan. It's just a question of, but you're right. I mean, when I'm in Egypt in a public space, people don't know what your identity is, right? They think you are what the majority is, and so you behave in such a way, and I don't make an issue about it one way or the other.
Gotcha. Okay, we have maybe 10 minutes I'm just going through some of these questions. What's something that inspires you, and what are your hopes for the future and the next generation, or what are some things you want to see happen, or just some new developments or cool things?
Yes, that's in a region where half the countries are in conflict or in failed states, or are things are actually going down in a downward spiral. It's hard to be very optimistic, but I am optimistic. I feel that the what inspires me is the young people and their involvement in recent years, increasing involvement in politics and in wanting to change the fate of their societies. So the Arab Spring may not have resulted in much in terms of democratization or development, except maybe in one country like maybe Tunisia and possibly Morocco, but it has resulted in a generation of young people who feel that they have a stake in the system and who have tried experimented with political activism, with community activism, etc. And so I think it's watching these young people and what they're going to do in the future that's really inspires me. In particular, I also see there's a great deal of a new culture of entrepreneurship in the region. A lot of young people are creating new startups, are creating new companies. They're not relying on the government to give them a job. So while the old systems under, in the 70s and 80s and 60s, where the government was going to do everything for you, young people now realize that that's not going to be the case, and that they're going to have to do things themselves. And so that, again, is a source of inspiration for me.
No, that's great. That's great. Um, Trying to think, we have a little bit more time. Is there any advice you could give us? I mean, I'm saying for myself, I'm studying urban planning. My specialization is international development. I'm definitely looking to go back, maybe to the African continent, some similar type of work, but I'm not sure where or like when that would happen. Do you have any advice as to? I don't know what I'm asking right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. I am always advising my own students, and so it's so basically, I think that you know, planners and people who work in international development are people with interdisciplinary backgrounds like planning and to some extent public health are people who have to work across different areas of knowledge to bring people together who are different types of expertise to solve complex problems. So I call you guys integrators, right? You're going to integrate knowledge from various silos so that you can work and solve complex problems that bring environment together with human capital and education and health, together with economics, together with politics. So having that expertise that can negotiate these various realms is really important. Now, it does not happen on its own. It happens when you have the knowledge, but you also go and practice it. So you really need to get that time on the ground. So my advice to you is find any way possible to go and be in a context that you want to professionally work in later, as a volunteer, even just buying a ticket and getting in there and letting things happen once you arrive. But I know that's more risky, but at least find opportunities to get an internship, to get a field experience of some sort, so that you can gain that experience on the ground. I find that is the one thing that really makes the stuff you learn in school gel and become real when you get to practice it. And then if you have a chance to, after that kind of experience, to come back and reflect about it in an academic setting, that's fine. But if not, you can then turn that into a professional, well-paying job. So I would say, don't go for the professional, well-paying job right away. Try to find something that will develop you, but in a context that is really a context that you want to learn about. So go to Africa and try to find something to do there that is working with the communities that you're interested in and with the problems that you're interested in. Oh, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that.
No.
Okay, so we have one question. Can you talk about the population growth in Egypt, a large country in Africa that continues to experience a relatively high growth rate? What does this mean for the likely improvement of the labor markets? And has family planning received a less emphasis in the last 10 years?
Yes, you touch on a very important issue, because Egypt had made very good strides in reducing fertility rates, which are the basis of population growth, starting in the early 80s and going all the way through the 2000s. As a result, what you had is there was a youth bulge, because in the early 80s, at the time when fertility was still high, there was a lot of improvement in child survival. And that happened through medical interventions or health interventions that prevented the death of children through diarrheal diseases and through pulmonary diseases. But that improvement in child survival came first, and then fertility decline came later. So there was a huge cohort of people who were born and survived, and therefore created the youth bulge. Now, the youth bulge in Egypt had peaked by about 2015. So that kind of was the peak of the youth bulge, and it was coming down since then. But before that, even before maybe 2010, but since the Egyptian revolution in 2011, there has been a de-emphasis on family planning programs. Egypt was getting a lot of aid from the US to fund family planning programs, and that ended in 2011. And since then, the government now realizes that they really have to kind of emphasize that again, but there was a period of time in which there was less emphasis on it. There's also the issue that young women who were used to in the past be able to get public sector jobs are not able to get jobs anymore. So when you have women who do not have a high opportunity cost of time, then having an extra child is probably not such an issue. So fertility has crept up a bit over the last few years. So it went from it had gone down to 3 children per woman, and now it's back up to 3.5. So the big question, is that a long-term trend, or is that a stalling and it's going to come back down? We don't know. But there has been, at least in the last 5 to 10 years, a slowing down of the fertility decline, if not a reversal of the fertility decline. And that could create problems, 5, 10, 20 years down the line. Already we're feeling the schools are getting overcrowded again, but maybe another 10 years down the line is going to be in the labor market. But I hope that it's a temporary reversal, and that you'll be able, fertility will start declining again.
Well, it's 10:31. I guess the class is kind of free to leave if you need to. Peace out.
Ragui, do you have, we always like to, well, first, thank you for doing this, and we'll let you go on about your day, but do you have questions for us? Or Janae or Brandon, do you have anything any final question you want to ask?
Well, I think it's great that you guys are doing this. So what happens with this interview? with these interviews as far as the class is concerned? Do you write something about it later, or what do you do from that point on?
I'm going to actually ask one of the students on this because I know exactly what they're doing and I want to make sure they know what they're doing. So I'm going to ask them to answer that question.
I mean, for one thing, I want to say that I'm very impressed with the amount of preparation that has gone into these interviews. So that I want to acknowledge. There's obviously a lot of work that has been done before the interview. And now I'm asking about what about after the interview.
Are you saying I've done a lot of work or they have?
No,
I know it's they have.
They
Yes.
So what we're going to do with this wonderful information that we've been collecting throughout the semester is that we're going to create a podcast that's really highlighting a lot of the really important parts of international development and economic development, public health, refugees. So we're going to use all that information and create a really beautiful podcast, and hopefully we'll be able to, showcase that for you. And maybe you can share with your students also.
would love it. I would love to get a copy of that podcast for sure.
Okay. So we've divided into 5 groups, and so there'll be 5 different. Podcast. You think of a series, and we're sort of doing one podcast, but we're doing 5 different groups, so you can think of it as a series of 5 podcasts.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds wonderful. No, I'd love to see it, and it could be a model for our students as well. So we'll see.
Yeah, it's been nice because we've had people participate like you from the U.S., but also from around the world. We're talking to, do you know Give Directly? Do you know the group Give Directly? They do unconditional cash transfers.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so it's this, the rage and development assistance of these unconditional cash transfers. And so they're one of the groups that does it. And we're talking to someone in London, their research director, next week. And then we're talking to the city development director, Johannesburg, and we're talking to a former colleague of mine in Dar es Salaam who works on informal settlement. So it's a mix of domestic-based people working in international development like you, and then lots of other people from around the world.
Great. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it is very cool.
I look forward to seeing the podcast anyway.
Yes. Well, thanks again for such a generous amount of your time and in your.
You're welcome. I hope it fulfilled your expectations anyway.
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay.
Take care.
Hope to see you
Thank you.
next time you're in Washington. You got to look us up.
I will. Okay. Bye.
Okay. Talk to you later. Bye-bye. Okay. Thank you, guys. Any kind of takeaways before you go into your little dreary Friday existence? The highlight of the day is gone, and you have to kind of pick up the pieces from now on. Nope. Okay.
I have to say, this is my second interview, and I feel much more comfortable.
Yeah.
This time around.
Yes. It's like anything. I mean, it's such a cliche to say, but it's like anything. The first time I tried to run a 10K race, it was a disaster, and the second time was much better. It'd be a disaster again, though, now if I tried. So the point is that the second one was better. You just have to keep it up. Keep those interviews coming. Okay, so I'll let you guys go if there's no other questions. I am posting, I have the interview guides or the background ready for next week. I'll post that in the next half hour. And that's for I'm trying to think, who's it for? It's for Michael Cook and for, Dan Hornweg. So those are ready to go. And who's on board for that? Sroj, you're on one, aren't you? Yeah. And is Samantha, are you on? No, Samantha's not here. Is she on? Here. Oh, yes, you are, right there in the middle.
I'm on both.
You're on both, exactly. Oh, that'll be it.
Brandon has stepped up to be my teammate, so I feel like I'm actually loved again. I was feeling a little bit lonely.
I know. I saw that gap there. I thought we had to get someone. Yeah. Well, that should be interesting. I'd like your reflections on how well 2 in a row went, if that was, because that's a lot of prep. Not just the Friday of, but obviously the Tuesday and Wednesday leading up to it.
Yes.
Yeah. We'll work it out.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, thanks, guys, and I'll see you next week. But feel free to email or call in between if there's anything that comes up.
Awesome.
Okay, take care.
All right, see you.
Bye.